good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Foreign Policy Research Institute's event that we're calling North Korea, Decoding the Enigmatic Regime. I'm Michael Beckley. I'm the director of the Asia program, and on behalf of FPRI, I'd like to welcome all of you, whether you're watching live right now or later on FPRI's YouTube page. For those of you that are coming in right now, I'll be taking questions for our esteemed guests, so I encourage you to put some in the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. As always, thanks to our supporters and members, some of whom are going to be in the audience this morning. We couldn't do this type of programming without you, and we are very grateful for these type of opportunities. It's my great pleasure to introduce Yong Suk Lee. He is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Asia program. He served for 22 years in various senior leadership positions with the Central Intelligence Agency and as a member of the Senior Intelligence Service. He started as an analyst way back in 1997, and then he went on to hold major senior leadership positions, including as the Deputy Associate Director of the CIA for Korea. He was also chief of the Korea Department, and he also was a briefer on the President's daily briefing staff from 2007 to 2009. Today, we're very lucky because we essentially get the position of the president in the sense that Yong is going to give us a briefing of sorts on North Korea, what it wants, what the leadership believes, what to expect in the coming years. This is obviously such an important question, and yet with war going on in Europe, with tensions rising with China, sometimes news about North Korea gets relegated to page 13, even though in any other era, I think this would be a major political development and even a crisis that's developing. So to help answer many of our questions and to probably lead to some more, I'll turn the floor over to Yong. Yong, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for having me. And thanks to everybody out there in participating today and attending the webinar. Well, thank you for the warm welcome and this opportunity to meet virtually with FPRI. My name is Yong Lee, and I'm very glad to be on this call with everybody today. First, I want to make clear that my remarks do not represent the views of the United States government. These remarks were clear, what I'm about to tell you, and my remarks were clear by the U.S. government per my post-employment agreement, but they do not represent the views of the U.S. government. I served with the CIA from January 97 to March 2019. It was pretty awesome. Loved it every day. However, I am retired. I'm no longer affiliated with the U.S. government or the Central Intelligence Agency. As I said, I spent 22 years, most of it following North Korea. I studying North Korea as a graduate student and continued into government service. In total, I was a professional student of Korea for 26 years, from 1993 to 2019. Over the years, I had many different ways of describing North Korea to people. An enigma wrapped in a mystery, a place with the worst policy options and a warehouse full of bad options. My favorite, however, was an analogy based on a popular TV show. I first used it in the early 2000s, and I recently heard it on a cable news show, so I guess if nothing else, this description really stuck in people's minds. I used to ask people to imagine Tony Soprano and his crew going back in time with nuclear weapons and taking over a medieval country, and that's North Korea. And this remains true even today. North Korea is a desperately poor agricultural country with a collapsed infrastructure. Google the words North Korea in nighttime and you'll see the result of a brutal dictatorship that provides its people with no food, no medicine, or no electricity, but demands absolute obedience. The search results will show you a nighttime satellite picture of North Korea, and it is pitch black. Yet this country that cannot even keep the lights on holds neighboring countries hostage because it's able to duplicate nuclear weapons and missile technology that the United States and the Soviet Union perfected in the 1950s. This country with no electricity has developed an army of hackers who are able to defeat some of the most sophisticated cyber defenses in the world. North Korea really is indeed a study in contradictions. Some of you may already know quite a bit about North Korea or follow developments in Asia very closely. Some of you may in this call may be very familiar with North Korea from what you read in the headlines. I hope by the end of the session today, you'll be familiar with just one person's view who studied North Korea for a long time, my view and my personal observations on the origins of North Korea's behavior and why it is so obsessed with the United States. North Korea, ruled by a Kim family regime, I say is a necrocratic state and a kleptocracy. I say the North is a necrocratic state because the official head of North Korea's founder Kim Il-sung, who died in 1994, the official head of state is a dead guy. I tried to find out when the last time the world had a necrocratic state, and I think we have to go look all the way back to the ancient Greeks. And North Korea as a kleptocracy is well publicized and documented, ranging from drug smuggling to cyber crimes. North Korea has a dubious distinction of being the only country who's been called out by the United Nations for violating the UN Convention on the Protection of Endangered Species. North Korean diplomats for years have been accused of using their diplomatic status to smuggle wildlife or wildlife parts, such as ivory and rhino horns, around the world, and smuggling out of Africa for sale around the world. The most infamous of North Korea's criminal behavior, and the one that many of you probably heard of, is when the North Korean hackers hacked into Sony Pictures Entertainment in retaliation for the Seth Rogen and James Franco's movie, The Interview. North Korea did this in retaliation for a comedy movie about two inept assassins disguised as journalists trying to assassinate the North Korean leader, Kim Jong Un. The reason North Korea engages in criminal activities is that it is a desperately poor country and needs the money. For example, North Korea recently sold missiles and other arms to Russia, and these arms are being used against Ukraine. It's a vicious circle for North Korea. They engage in criminal activities because North Korea has been heavily sanctioned and is mostly shut out of the global economy. They're shut out of the global economy because the things they do to earn money, selling weapons, smuggling wildlife, are illegal in most countries, including in North Korea, and violates existing sanctions, treaties, and a host of other international conventions which North Koreans have signed on to. It's an endless loop. North Korea is probably maybe the heaviest sanctioned country in the world, and it's still because of their unswerving dedication to develop nuclear, mostly because their unswerving dedication to develop nuclear weapons and capabilities to deliver them. North Korea has shown that it's even willing to sell nuclear technology, building a nuclear reactor in Syria, which the Israeli Air Force destroyed in 2006. North Korea sold nuclear technology to Syria while it was actively engaged in the six-party talks on denuclearization with US, Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan. President George W. Bush famously described North Korea as one of the axis of evil in the modern world in his 2002 State of the Union speech. Wait, is North Korea evil? Is that why it's behaving this way? Well, it all goes back to North Korea's founder, who remains the country's eternal president, the late Kim Il-sung. Fundamental reasons for North Korean behavior and to understand North Korea, my personal belief, once again, is that North Korea is a country built on a lie. And it was he who started the lie. Every nation has an origin story, and North Korea's origin myth remains an integral part of its national identity and key to understanding its strategic culture, how it views the world, and its relationship with the United States. It all started in the early 20th century when the Japanese occupied and ruled all of Korea as a colony from 1910 to 1945. Kim Il-sung, born 1912, was one of those Koreans who actively resisted the Japanese rule as a partisan fighter. Kim became a communist as a teenager, and he fought the Japanese military in Korea and China, commanding a small company of Korean fighters as part of a Chinese Communist Party's military. Kim and his band of Korean fighters had some successes, but in the end, they ended up being on the run, being chased by the Japanese army in Manchuria. They were chased out of Manchuria and eventually escaped into the Soviet Far East, where Kim Il-sung and his band joined the Soviet Red Army during World War II. Kim Il-sung was a major in the Soviet Red Army when the war ended. As a former Japanese colonial possession, Korea Peninsula was divided in half, US in the south, Soviet Union in the north, and Soviets placed a young 33-year-old major, Kim Il-sung, in charge of the northern half. Kim Il-sung's right to rule Korea was given to him by Joseph Stalin, and his legitimacy was backed up by the Soviet Red Army. This way, Kim Il-sung was no different than all the other puppet regimes the Red Army installed in Eastern Europe following World War II. Kim Il-sung, early on in his rule, advocated for the invasion of South Korea and unifying the Korean Peninsula by force. He insisted to Joseph Stalin that the U.S. was preoccupied with the occupation and reconstruction of Japan and would not defend South Korea. Eventually, Stalin relented, probably just to get Kim Il-sung off his back. Well, who started the Korean War? It was Kim Il-sung. There have been many books written on the origins of the Korean War, but it all comes down to the historical fact that Kim invaded South Korea with Stalin's permission and support, thinking the U.S. would not come to South Korea's aid. 2 million Koreans lost their lives during the war. Pre-war population of the two Koreas, North and South, was around 30 million. So that's almost 10% of the population. Over 26,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives defending South Korea. The U.S.-led Allied forces came close to decimating the North Korean military until the Chinese intervened to save North Korea, and China suffered close to 1 million casualties, killed and wounded, defending North Korea. And one of the killed in action was Chairman Mao's son, who was killed during a U.S. Air Force bombing strike in Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung, after the Korean War ended in a stalemate that continues today, had to fight for his political life. North Korea was devastated by the war and 3 years of nonstop U.S. Air Force bombing. Kim Il-sung's decision to go to war was an unmitigated disaster for the North Koreans. Kim Il-sung was a genius politician, however. He's a survivor. And with the Soviet and Chinese backing, he was able to outmaneuver his opponents and avoid accountability for the Korean War. It also helped that Moscow was preoccupied with the Cold War in Europe and the death of Joseph Stalin during this time, and Beijing was preoccupied trying to deal with the isolated pockets of anti-communist resistance in Taiwan. So this is where history ends and mythology begins. Ask a North Korean how the Korean War started, and they will tell you it was because U.S. invaded North Korea. According to the North Korean version of events, in June 1950, the U.S. started the war against North Korea, and invading North Korea, killed millions of Koreans for no reason and remains hell-bent on destroying North Korea. The lie didn't stop with Kim Il-sung avoiding responsibility for starting the Korean War. Kim and his supporters rewrote the history book on how Kim Il-sung came to be in charge of North Korea. North Koreans will tell you that Kim Il-sung was a military genius who defeated the Japanese in China and Korea, and that Kim liberated the entire Korean Peninsula in a joint operation with the Soviet Union and the U.S., and that the U.S. betrayed him because he was jealous of Kim Il-sung's military genius and saw him as a threat. The U.S. then took over the southern half of Korea for itself and brutalizing the people, installing a puppet regime, and their brothers and sisters in South Korea wants unification more than anything else. Search North Korean propaganda in a search engine, watch some videos, and read some examples of what North Korean media claims. It is ludicrous. It claims Kim family rulers can fly fast jets, write symphonies, and that miraculous natural occurrences like double rainbows and dancing white cranes take place when the Kims are around. Unfortunately for the United States, North Korea's propaganda and myth-making is no laughing matter. Why? Well, Kim Il-sung is the hero in the North Korean myth, and every hero needs a villain, and the U.S. is the villain, and we have no choice about this. Resisting the United States became North Korea's reason for existing. It's about the only reason it exists. North Korea exists today to oppose the United States. It is how North Korea differentiates itself from South Korea, and how it justified years of belt tightening, and the famine, and all the hardships that people suffered that was necessary to put weapons development and military spending first before taking care of the people. North Korea for decades survived on Soviet subsidies and suffered a devastating famine that killed, in some estimates, 600,000 to 1 million people after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War era subsidies ended. But once again, why was there a famine? Not because of decades of communist mismanagement, but because of US economic warfare. Why is the North Korean economy hobbled by sanctions? Not because of anything the three-generation Kim family dictators have done, but because the US wants to destroy North Korea. Do North Koreans believe all this? I ask myself this question all the time. Kim Il-sung knew he was lying. He was lying to save his own political life, as politicians are known to do. His allies supported a lie for their own benefit, and anyone who could point out that Kim Il-sung was a middle school dropout, who was a major in the Soviet army, were purged, dead, or dare not speak. As years passed, these lies and myths became the gospel in North Korea. Kim Jong Un, who took over North Korea after his father Kim Il-sung died, was only 80 years old when the Korean War started. Did he know his father was lying? He may have, but Kim Jong Un, as a young man, also took charge of propaganda in the country, tasked with making his father seem like a godlike figure. This way, Kim Jong Un also solidified his own political future. Who else can succeed a godlike figure but the son of God himself? What about the North Korean leader today? Kim Jong Un, the grandson of the founder, born in 1984. Does he know his grandfather was lying? And probably not. So what? What does all this have to do with North Korea today? Well, from North Korea's perspective, if your existence is being threatened by a superpower villain who is hell-bent on your destruction, developing nuclear weapons makes perfect sense. And North Korea's nuclear arsenal growing makes it a global problem. There are plenty of nations and non-state actors who would pay a fortune to get their hands on a nuclear device, and North Korea can certainly use the cash. Kim Jong Un, for his part, probably cannot understand why US leaders, one after another, wants to destroy his country. Why is the US this way? Why can't the US just let North Korea live in peace? I wonder if anyone's ever explained to him. I wonder if his father, Kim Jong Un, ever told him, look, your grandpa came up with a bunch of BS stories to save his own skin after the war. Probably not. And I always thought the worst thing anyone can say to Kim Jong Un is tell him the brutal truth that most Americans probably cannot find Korea on a map and really don't care. Kim Jong Un's father and grandfather certainly did not do him any favors. He was raised to believe that it is his job to defend the country against an imminent US invasion and was left with a nuclear arsenal to do the job. And from the looks of it, he's trying to provide his daughter early on the job training at a young age to continue the family business. President Joe Biden will be perfectly happy. Biden will be perfectly happy if he never hears the word North Korea. He has enough problems to deal with at home and abroad, and we'll be glad if North Korea just stay quiet. But that's really not possible. Expecting North Korea to leave the US alone is like asking a stalker, why can't you just leave me alone? In an ideal world, North Korea will give up nuclear weapons and missiles, and US will lift all sanctions against North Korea. And the future of the Korean Peninsula, whether or not North and South reunifies, will be left up to the Korean people. Hopefully, North Korea will then no longer engage in criminal activities and will instead focus on attracting foreign investment step by step, improving its economy. Is this possible? Well, anything is possible. All human beings are capable of growth and change. And I think a key indicator of this change will be observing closely North Korea's relationship with South Korea. North Korea constantly threatens and belittles South Korea. How North Korea threatens South Korea is troubling as well, threatening to turn its cities into sea of fire. South Korea is a world-class modern military that trains close to NATO standards. And North Korea is a vintage 1950s era military with a 1950s era nuclear weapons. South Korea has no plans to invade North Korea. It's more than capable of defending itself, but it also doesn't want to risk losing a major city to a North Korean WMD attack just to prove a point. South Korea is a first world G20 economy, and it raised itself from devastation of war and poverty over the last 70 years and has zero interest in placing its prosperity at risk. Frankly, South Korea has more to lose than the North. There has never been a political entity on the Korean Peninsula as wealthy and free as South Korea is today, and this is what makes South Korea an existential threat to the Kim family rulers. South Korea is a living proof to the world that the Kim family regime is not the only path to peace and prosperity for the Korean people. In fact, Kim family rulers have provided just the opposite. South Korea in the early 2000s, during an era of engagement and rapprochement with North Korea, opened its wallet, building its roads and factories in North Korea. And during this time, South Korea decided its best interest to try to help lift North Korea out of poverty, so you would stop begging or threatening the international community for food aid, and I'm sure the government in South Korea will gladly do it again. However, as long as Kim Jong Un or whoever follows him sees South Korea as a threat, just because it exists and is doing fine without them, I'll say that there's no chance North Korea will take the necessary steps to rejoin the international community. When a North Korean leader looks at South Korea and says, we can do that too, and asks for help and takes the necessary steps to get there, that's when you will see change. But is that consistent with a communist dictatorship? Is that consistent with a hereditary communist dictatorship where you're descendant from a godlike figure? It'll be tough. I still don't have good answers to the question, where do we go from here? And I'm still trying to figure it out. And I hope the discussions today and the questions today will help me along that pathway. And if I ever do find out, or if I do feel like, aha, I have an answer, I promise I'll come back and share it first with everybody at FPRI. Thank you for being here today, and hope I was able to provide a bit more context beyond the headlines of why North Korea behaves a certain way and why it seems so obsessed with the US. If nothing else, provide some food for thought for the next time you see North Korea in the news. Thank you.
Yong, thank you so much for that opening statement. I think that was very clarifying. And as tends to be the case, questions are starting to fly in, which is a sign of an excellent and insightful talk. I wanted to take my prerogative as the chair to ask the first question, which, you described North Korea as essentially Tony Soprano with nukes, and I assume you've watched the show, and so you're well aware that Tony gets his fair amount of pushback, a fair amount of internal dissent, and in my opinion, he dies at the end of the show. And several people in the chat have asked, what about regime stability? What's your assessment? Obviously, it's a very difficult question to get at, but how stable is Kim Jong Un's regime? Are there any players that you could foresee that might challenge a Kim dynasty, especially if some kind of crisis breaks out? Do you see Kim Yo-jong as a potential successor? Can you give us a sense of, to what extent we can, the court politics going on within the Kim dynasty?
Yeah. So first of all, Kim Jong is in charge. He's not a puppet. There's no one manipulating him. But one of the things I tell people is that you want to think about the Kim regime as a Kim family Inc. They say Queen Elizabeth of England used to describe the royal family as the firm. That's actually not a bad description for North Korea. You have the Kim family at its core, but you have a series of relationships and commitments that goes all the way back to the 1930s, when they were like this ragtag band of guerrillas being on the run from the Japanese army. The old family, the Che's, and their descendants are still the key regime stakeholders of the Kim family regime. And they're in the key party positions. They're for a long time in the key military security service positions. And they're literally the shareholders of the regime. They're the ones who benefit. These people are the North Korean elite of the elite. Now, if there's suddenly you have to ask about motivation. Why would they are their livelihood and their status is protected and it's all rallying around the Kim family. What's in it for them to do a regime change? So let's say Kim Jong Un, there's a history of heart disease in that family. Both him and his father died of heart disease. Heart disease and obesity runs in that family. And, if, let's say Kim Jong Un had a cardiac episode, there's really no incentive for the members of the Kim family, like Inc., whose relationships go all the way back to the grandfather, to suddenly look for something new. It's most likely that they're going to put a family member up and try to go for stability. Now, how much control do they absolutely obey? How much control they have over? Depends on the individual and how it evolves. I think it helped Kim Jong Un a lot that his father, after his stroke and health crisis, named him early on as a successor, and he had that period before his father passed away to really learn the family business for just like what good 3-4 years. And once again, the core elite was incentivized to support Kim Jong Un, the continuation of the Kim family dynasty. Because if not, what are they going to become? They're just going to become poor South Koreans, or be held for, or be facing some kind of a tribunal, or being chased around by JSOC with their face on a deck of cards. So it's the people who own the guns, own the wealth, and have the political power. They're incentivized to continue the business.
And what's your assessment of the economic situation of the regime? Because the alternative scenario is not so much an internal coup, but just that the revenue streams start to dry up and the regime just finds it harder to run a patronage system, and then also just can't modernize its defenses or its nuclear forces. Do you have a sense of how those revenue streams are doing and how sustainable they are going forward?
When I joined the agency in January '97 and joined the Korea Analytic Division. At the time, we were just coming out of a task force period, the Korea Working Group. A lot of the analysts, what we were thinking about was how long can this place last? A lot of people are amazed that it didn't collapse right away, along like East Germany and all the other regimes. And by the early 2000s, I've kind of given up waiting for North Korea to collapse, and started looking and really, this was a real big kind of growth moment for me as a North Korea watcher, really kind of looking at the elements of stability. Instead of asking when is this place going to collapse, I said, what is helping this place survive? First of all, North Korea collapsed. North Korea collapsed a long time ago. North Korea collapsed in the 1990s. North Korea today is not the state that it was before. In the early 1970s, 60s and 70s, when people were talking about a Korean miracle, they weren't talking about South Korea. They were talking about North Korea. It was a pretty well-functioning modern nation state with a pretty good education system and a public health system, took care of its people, actually, and by some indexes, better than how the South Koreans took care of their people in the 60s and 70s. And all that collapsed, and it still collapsed. North Korea provides zero service for their own people. And it's just their people are focused basically on hand-to-mouth existence. So what you see today is just very kind of stripped down, almost like intensive care patient in which you're in intensive care and the only thing that's functioning are critical life support systems. And that's how it has been sustaining. The government really, I think the last time the government tried to basically really elbow their way into people's lives and how they live was this very ill thought out currency reform I think around 2010. That was the last time they tried to bring the unofficial economy somewhat into the official economy, and that just completely backfired. A bunch of people ended up getting shot, being blamed for Kim Jong Il's policy misstep, and they just let it go. So as long as you don't do anything political, you're left alone to survive. So that takes care of the people, and the revenue stream. A lot of it is illicit. A lot of it is illicit. the cyber security, the cyber hack, cyber criminal behavior, fleecing the cryptocurrency markets. That's a strong revenue stream. The other thing is that North Korea is a very natural resource rich country. So big revenue stream is seafood exports. Big revenue stream is coal. They have I think North Korea has the most abundant supply of uranium, natural deposit of uranium in the world. Uh, lumber, logging, and a lot of it also is labor exports, exporting lumberjacks to Russia, Far East, exporting factory workers around to China. So those are all kind of key revenue streams. And when is that going to dry up? You need key participation by China and Russia, and and the U.S. government over the last many years have talked to the Chinese, talked to the Russians, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. What is it in it for
That
them?
was going to be my next question, Yong, is, it seems almost like North Korea's fortunes are growing now with, as you have tensions between the United States and China and Russia, respectively. They're increasingly building out their links with North Korea. Can you give us a sense of how significant that is and how you see this sort of emerging strategic triangle among Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang evolving in the years ahead?
That, as I said, I think a lot of the policymakers thought, well, the Chinese, we can ask the Chinese for help. We can ask the Russians for help. And maybe it was more hopeful in the 1990s, early 1990s or mid 1990s. But when I was more actively involved and thinking about it, and meeting with various government officials, it came down to why should the Chinese do any favors for the United States? Why should the Russians do any favors for the United States? I mean, if this was in the 2000s, now think about it in the 2024 context. Definitely have zero interest in doing any favors for the U.S. And in fact, if you think about North Korean behavior, they're a useful strategic distraction in East Asia that keeps U.S. distracted. So it distracts away from an anti-Russia strategy, distracts away from an anti-China strategy. As for the future, I think the relationship is very transactional. Definitely for the Russians, very transactional. It's North Korea provides cheap source of arms. I know people made a big deal about, Putin met with Kim Jong Un in Vladivostok. It's important to point out that Putin invited Kim Jong Un to some event he was already going to attend. I think he goes to the Russian Far East every few years, and it happened that last summer was one of those years where he's visiting Vladivostok, the only subsequential city that far out there, and invited Kim Jong Un. So really, we're just like setting an extra plate at the table, and it reflects more of how far Russia has fallen, because you talk to interact with some of these Russian and Chinese government officials. I mean, they had nothing but disgust and disparaging remarks about North Korea. But if you think about a grand strategic sense, it's useful to distract the United States. It's not useful to go along with the Americans and potentially destabilize a country on their border.
Do you see any frictions emerging between Moscow and Beijing because of North Korea? So some people have argued that, as Russia colludes increasingly with North Korea, in some ways it gives them both some leverage vis-a-vis Beijing because they're now no longer quite as dependent as they might otherwise be. And in some ways, Russia seems to be going towards becoming a giant North Korea in the sense that it's an ally of China. It's much weaker, but it's still powerful enough to stand up for itself and kind of do its own thing, despite whatever Beijing may want it to do. Do you see Russia, North Korea moving beyond, as you said, these sort of initial meetings and building out their relationship more such that frictions could emerge with Beijing? Or is this is all pretty small potatoes stuff, and at the end of the day, the overriding strategic imperative of standing up to the West of the United States will keep these three powers working almost entirely cooperatively with each other?
Yeah, I think they're coming to a point where they're sharing more and more of they have a common strategic goal, which is basically kind of anti-US, anti-West. I think it's the more interesting question is how that may impact frankly, China and Russia's relationship with South Korea. And South Korea has a lot of business stake in Russia. I mean, and China remains, I mean, that's one of the most important trading partners for South Korea. So as for how the Russia North Korean relationship will impact China relationship with China, that's a great question. I haven't really quite thought about it that way, but that's certainly a great question. The historical relationship has always been closer to Russia because once again it's a Soviet founded country, and there's a deep historical animosity between Mao and Kim Il Sung. So it's that relationship. People talk about, oh, they're such close allies. Not really. The two countries never liked each other. Once again, because for Mao, that's mini Stalin at his doorstep during the Sino-Soviet split. We'll see how it goes. But right now, as long as anti-US and frustrating American designs becomes their strategic goal, I don't see much. I can't really see much friction. And China has so much more to offer than Russia and North Korea combined can even imagine. I can't imagine that those two teaming up would cause Xi Jinping to lose any sleep.
Okay, well, I have to say, Yong, this is a pretty dark picture that we're painting here. The sense I got from your talk is that North Korea, their survival is essentially dependent on retaining and modernizing their nuclear and missile forces. So there's no real prospect of a freeze for freeze, and certainly not of denuclearization anytime soon. I guess my question is, one, is that in fact your assessment? And two, if that's true, is at least North Korea still deterrable over the long run? So if Kim Jong Un and the Kim dynasty are essentially just a kleptocratic regime, there's no sort of broader ideology other than a cult of personality for domestic, internal regime security purposes. They're not evangelizing and trying to spread communist regimes around the world. And they want to live. Does that then make them deterrable in the sense that they don't want to start a war where they're going to be wiped off the map? And so as long as the United States and South Korea maintain their military capabilities, that deterrence will prevail. And at the end of the day, nuclear weapons just aren't that useful for really making major gains. They're great for deterrence, but maybe not so much for compellence. Is that your assessment, or are there certain ways that North Korea's expanding nuclear arsenal may actually create the pretext or opportunity for offensive action, whether it's a full-scale aggression against the South or something more minor skirmishes, or the selling of nuclear technology to other anti-American regimes?
Yeah, honestly, I think the biggest threat North Korea's nuclear weapons proposes is proliferation. I have a classified number in my head, and that number was CIA's estimate of North Korean nuclear weapons, and that's what, March, and even the March 2019, and people ask me, and even then, when people ask me how many nuclear weapons North Korea have, my answer was, well, it's not to ruin your day, because at some point, it just really enough to ruin your day, and let's say the figure starts to grow, and it doesn't make them more threatening against South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. I think it just becomes more threatening to the global order, because then they have more than enough that they can use to defend themselves. How many nuclear weapons does North Korea really need to defend itself? I mean, yeah, maybe it needs to modernize its nuclear force every decade or so. But with that growing stockpile, I think it just comes back to North Korea has never developed a piece of technology that it didn't try to sell. never developed a weapon system that he didn't try to export. And once again, they showed that they're well to do that with the association with AQ Khan, building a Yongbyon-style nuclear reactor in the middle of the Syrian desert. So I think the biggest concern is proliferation. And as for what kind of threat they pose, I think one of the things that I really learned as a historian, especially with the fall of the Soviet Union and when the Russian archives were open and you had the early archival evidence from Russia or about Soviet Union and their decision making, what really struck me was the conservatism of the Soviet decision makers, the fear. They were more driven by how much they were motivated by fear, and because either you're in charge, either the Communist Party is in charge, or you end up like Mussolini. It's not like South Korea, it's not like U.S. Presidents don't retire, write memoirs, and go on book tours. Either you die in your sleep in your bed, still in charge, or you die lined up against the wall. So I people I one of the things I always say is it's not conducive to Kim Jong Un's long-term survival to wake up one morning and decide he's going to nuke LA or nuke Seoul. Um, the tensions became pretty high in the early years of President Trump's administration in 2017. What did they do? They looked for a way out and ended up agreeing to a summit. It's not conducive to their long-term survival to be adventuristic and militaristic. Two things that I would advocate. One, next time the North Koreans do something to provocate against the South Korea, we should let the South Koreans respond. The most obvious example was in, I believe, 2010 when they bombarded Yongpyeong Island. And the level of pressure, diplomatic pressure, the U.S. put on, including the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff flying all the way to Seoul, just to stop the South Koreans from resuming the exercise that the bombardment interrupted, saying that he would send the wrong message. Lee Myung-bak, to his credit, went ahead and said, "We're going to finish this exercise." It's next time the North Koreans kill South Korean citizens, we should let the South Koreans respond the way it wants to and not twist its arm to try to get them to stop. Because once again, we're not making the problem any better. And North Koreans are counting on the US to do just that. And they love nothing more than to just bloody the South Koreans' nose and see the US, the big brother, twist South Korea's arms to the breaking point that he cannot reply. Let the South Koreans respond. It will completely upend Kim Jong Un's strategic calculus. But once again, what is it rooted to? Rooted to self-preservation. Kim Jong Un, more so than President Yoon or Joe Biden, has more of an incentive to make sure this thing doesn't go out of control. And the second thing is, if you're really serious about nuclear talks, let's stop talking about denuclearization. That is just ridiculous. We're talking about disarmament. We're talking about force reduction, not denuclearization. Let's accept North Korea. We need to accept policy-wise that North Korea is a nuclear power. And people say, "Oh, what precedents that sets for South Korea and Japan?" Really? What, South Korea and Japan doesn't know North Korea is a nuclear power? It's some of those kind of basic fundamental things. I think we're really just kind of have our own tying our own arm behind our back when engaging the North Koreans.
So I take your point that the risk is more horizontal proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons and the sale of nuclear technology than any further improvements in North Korea's nuclear arsenal, because they've already got us in a sense. They have a big enough arsenal to cause a stir. But before I let that point go, I mean, over the last year or two, North Korea has gone on this testing spree of all different types of capabilities, the submarine launched ballistic missile, train mounted, and now they're experimenting quite a bit in space. And it just seems like they're going to cross that threshold, which presumably is major, of being able to credibly threaten the American homeland with a nuclear-tipped ICBM. And it just seems like if the American president has to think not just about risking Seoul, but Seattle in a crisis, that may make a difference. But you're saying at this point, they've already sort of crossed the threshold at which they can wield their nuclear arsenal in coercive fashion. And even though these advancements may be a signal of intent, they don't fundamentally change the equation. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they can already credibly threaten Guam. So what are we saying? That American lives in Seattle is more valuable than American lives in Guam? If that Rubicon has already been crossed. So I once again, like I don't really see, maybe people differentiate Seattle and Guam, but that's telling me American lives in Guam is less valuable than American lives in Seattle.
Okay. Well, as a native of San Francisco, I err on that side, but I take your point that American lives anywhere obviously are weighed equally. But then in terms of the question of what to do, you've said one way is to allow South Korea to take the gloves off, and it's notable in 2010. I mean, North Korea not only shelled Yongpyong Island, but sunk the Cheonan, sunk a South Korean ship, and killed a bunch of South Korean sailors. The Obama administration prevented the South from really doing much of anything in response. I guess what tools do South Korea or the United States have to respond to these kind of provocations? It seems like North Korea has already been sanctioned back into the Stone Age, and that doesn't really work. Military options, I mean,
once again, I think you should let South Koreans retaliate militarily against the point of origin. They know which base launched that attack. Allow them to take the base out. It's like, well, that might lead to a bigger war. Look, you're basically what we're doing now with policymakers. We're just admiring the problem, and I have no problem with that. But admit to yourself that you're just admiring the problem. What I got really sick and tired of was people thumping their chest. We're doing this. You're not doing a goddamn thing. Just please admit to yourself you're just admiring the problem. Because you think one more sanction is going to deter the North Koreans? You think one more ship visit is going to solve the North Korean problem? Either do something bold or admit the fact that you're just admiring the problem. You can do two things with the problem. You can manage it, wish it will go away, or you can resolve it. Resolving the problem, I think that train's left the station long time ago in the early 1990s when during the Clinton and Kim Jong Un administration, when they were talking about taking out the original facility at Yongbyon. But if you have a U.S. and South Korean government saying we're going to solve this problem, well, you only solve this problem one way, and that's removing Kim Jong Un from power, and you can only do that by military action or disarming North Korea by force. If you're doing sanctions, if you're doing nothing else, you're just admiring the problem. And if you're trying to resolve the problem, if you're trying to manage the problem some way more creatively, I think for example, tit for tat retaliation, proportionate military response to a military escalation, where it kills South Korean citizens or South Korean soldiers or U.S. citizens, U.S. soldiers. I think that's the one Rubicon we haven't crossed. And that's the one Rubicon that the North Koreans kind of assume that we won't cross, because part of their strategy is that madman strategy. Oh, we're North Korea, we're crazy, you don't know what we'll do. Well, call them on their bluff, because the times that when we did in 1976 and in 2003 and other times, and most recently with early years of the Trump administration, North Korea looks for a way out. Once again, it is not in the Kim family regime interest to escalate to a war.
And is your sense that the South Korea will remain sort of willing and able to initiate that kind of retaliation? I know the current administration seems much more willing. Like obviously, previous ones have adopted a sunshine policy and have been more dovish towards North Korea. So what's your assessment of South Korea's political evolution and their policy, obviously, vis-a-vis North Korea?
Well, I really encourage everybody to read Scott Steiner's new book that came out in the Council on Foreign Relations on U.S.-South Korean alliance and why important that is. We all know how polarized the current environment politically is in this country, unfortunately, and how policy made a shift from 180 degrees from one way or the other. The same goes for North Korea. I mean, same goes for South Korea and their North Korea policy. Right now, the conservatives in charge who are closely aligned with the US and wants to improve ties with Japan. Next presidential election in South Korea, next election, elect just one more election cycle away, it can easily swing the other way, where you have the progressives in charge, and they are suspicious of U.S. motives, and see North Korea as a brotherhood nation, and that they see that as a future path for stability. 180 degrees, night and day difference. And I've lived through both in the U.S. government. I can tell you from a U.S. government perspective how dramatically it is just on the dialogue of over North Korea. During the Roh Moo-hyun era, during the six-party talks, just from the six-party just observations from people who were there, every time North Koreans try to do something provocative and threatening, they said South Koreans always intervene. They said, well, that's not what they meant. That's what they meant. Until the North Koreans just got sick and tired. Would you just stay out of it and be quiet? And so once again, it's just that you have a South Korean government who wants to defend North Korea versus South Korean government and who sees U.S. Japan, the security relationship with U.S. and Japan as being the baseline and the most important thing for their alliance and the security. And Japan policy is another one, right? You have when the progressives in charge, the relationship with Japan just tanks, and they really kind of agitate the colonial past. But when the conservatives in charge, you just once again, they're not overlooking all the terrible things that happened in the Japanese colonial era, but they're putting that aside, saying that all three parties, U.S., Japan, and South Korea, we face a threat in our main enemy, North Korea. So yeah, once again, that'll probably, any kind of retaliation would only, from South Korea, would probably only come from a conservative administration.
Well, as we get to the end of our time here, I'm going to ask you to extrapolate a little bit from your long experience watching and dealing with North Korea to other potential U.S. adversaries, whether it's China or Russia. I guess my question is, are there lessons that the United States and its allies should learn from their experience dealing fairly unsuccessfully with North Korea over many decades for how to approach Russia, China, other adversaries? As one of the people in the chat mentioned, that some of this gets started because the United States leaves the Korean Peninsula outside of its defense perimeter prior to the Korean War, which gives the green light, obviously, for North to invade the South. Are there any broader lessons that we should take about how to deal with these aggressive authoritarian regimes, since we've sort of beta tested various policies with North Korea?
Yeah, I think one thing and I'll be the first one to admit this is all hindsight. But in foreign policy, I feel like one of the key lessons is really there's limited window of opportunity to do something, to make the hard decision. And I think as a government, and it's not just the U.S., plenty of Western governments and U.S. allied governments are guilty of this. I think people tend to, and maybe it's just human nature, people tend to avoid the hard decisions. So for example, China and the Spratly Islands and the South China Seas, there was a window of opportunity in which U.S. could have drawn a much harder line before China started building up this South China Seas, Spratly Islands, and building up and fortifying and militarizing the islands. But for the longest time, we just thought, well, China just needs to be guided, reform, economic development. It turned out that wasn't the case. Russia and Putin. All those times when Putin was committing murder on the streets of European capitals, when it invaded Ukraine in 2014. Those were windows of opportunity to send Putin a very clear and direct and hard message that this is not acceptable. What message did we send? Well, by 2022, Putin was probably, in his view, was probably thinking it's not a bad bet to think that the West, once again, will not do anything. So I think that's one of the things is just that there are just limited windows of opportunity to make the hard decisions, and that we really need to think seriously about if we by not acting, by not making this hard decision now, what are the consequences? I think that's the biggest lesson learned that I took away, that you have a limited window to solve problems. Then, because if you don't solve those problems in that limited window, it just becomes, you're just trying to manage the problem because that train's already left. And once again, that's an observation. I certainly, it's, yeah, once again, that's an observation from hindsight. And, how do we, can we just realistically expect policymakers in London, Paris, Seoul, Tokyo, and in Washington, D.C. to recognize those windows of opportunity? Yeah, that's a big question mark. But that's my biggest observation.
I think it is a pretty profound shift in perspective, because most people for so long have just wanted this problem to sort of go away, and how can we mitigate it, and strategic patience. So that is important. But if we're making big decisions, the last question I have for you is on nuclear weapons on the Allied side. So some people have talked about, should South Korea start doing some kind of nuclear sharing agreement with the United States? Should the Japanese and the South Koreans and others even consider developing a nuclear program of their own, because we're just entering a much more dangerous world where you essentially have to take gloves off? Do you have an opinion that you're willing to share on that? I don't want to cause an international incident by saying, former CIA operative says South Korea should go nuclear, but do you have a sense of what, if any, role nuclear weapons on the Allied side should play?
That's actually very easy answer for me, right? That's a question for me to answer. I said, that really is up to the South Korean people and the Japanese people. And that's not up for the United States to decide. And if, let's say, the South Korean, but once again, for the U.S., the difficult thing is like, well, let's say the South Korean government says, we want U.S. nuclear weapons on the peninsula. We'll, bring the nuclear weapons back. Well, that's a lot of investment that the U.S. military has to make. And if we go along with it, once again, but in a few years after another presidential election, you can come into an administration and say, we want all these nuclear weapons off the peninsula. So I think in the long run, it's just really, including what kind of decisions, what kind of relationship the South Korean people want to have with the U.S. It's it really is up to the South Korean people. You want Americans off the U.S. peninsula. Don't protest in front of the U.S. embassy. Go protest in front of the presidential embassy, the presidential office. Go protest in front of the National Assembly, because I can't think of a time when the U.S. forces during the Cold War that we didn't just pack our bags and left when some country told us to get out. That's our habit. So once again, those really are the questions that South Korean people and the Japanese people to answer. As for, do we let South Korea and Japan go nuke and develop their own nuclear weapons? Honestly, the genie's already out of the box, and that's a conversation between the P5 and all the other parties. But it's what are we preventing by what are we preventing? I think that's we need to. I don't have a firm opinion on it, but I think we need to kind of discuss it. So what are we trying to prevent? What are we preventing by not allowing these countries to have weapons?
Okay, Yong, well, you've been very generous with your insights and time, but before I let you go, could you recommend to folks in the audience sources you think would be especially helpful to learn more about this? I think you mentioned Scott Snyder's book on the U.S.-South Korean alliance.
Yeah.
Scott Snyder, the U.S.-South Korean alliance. Any other sources you think are especially striking for those of us that want to learn more about this issue?
Well, there's a recent new book by last name was Howe, and he was talking about when bad behavior pays. North Korea and nuclear when bad behavior pays.
Okay, that sounds good. When bad behavior pays. This was good behavior on your part. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. We'll leave it here for now, and we hope to see you on the next online installment of our strategic series. Thank you so much for everyone at FPR. Thank you, Yong.